Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic development that White House officials, European allies, and Kremlin watchers alike had feared, anticipated, and secretly prepared for. A development that unfolded not over weeks of careful negotiation, but in 48 hours. 48 hours that reshaped the entire trajectory of this war. 48 hours that forced Ukraine's president onto a plane bound for Florida. 48 hours that may have just cracked open the first real pathway to ending the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that Western diplomats had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with urgency, with purpose, and with what sources close to his office describe as controlled desperation, because make no mistake, what happened over the past 2 days has changed everything. The ceasefire offer, the conditions attached, the timing, the message, and now a Ukrainian president racing across the Atlantic to meet with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago before anyone else can control the narrative. This is breaking news. This is the most significant diplomatic shift we've seen since the war began. And tonight we're going to break down exactly what happened, what it means, and what comes next. For months now, there had been signals, not official diplomatic channels, not formal communications, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unexpected. Vladimir Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been predictable in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a pattern that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read. The troop buildups along certain borders, the rhetoric escalating in state media, the timing of major offensives aligned with political calendars. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Kyiv this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the encrypted traffic between Moscow and field commanders, the movement of strategic assets toward or away from the front lines, the tone of statements from the Kremlin's inner circle, the sudden changes in Putin's public schedule. All of that went quiet. And whenever Vladimir Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For 3 years, this war has ground forward with brutal predictability. Territory gained, territory lost, thousands dead, cities destroyed, and through it all, one constant: Putin's absolute refusal to negotiate from anything other than a position of dominance. He demanded Ukraine's surrender. He demanded NATO retreat. He demanded the West accept his vision of a redrawn European map. And every time peace talks were floated, they collapsed within days, sometimes within hours, because Moscow's conditions were designed not to end the war, but to win it through diplomacy, what they couldn't win on the battlefield. So when word began circulating through back channels last week that something had changed in Moscow's posture, experienced diplomats were skeptical. They had seen this before: the false starts, the performative gestures, the proposals designed to fail. But this time was different. This time, the signals weren't coming from the foreign ministry, they were coming from Putin himself. Early Tuesday morning, European intelligence services detected what they described as unusual diplomatic activity, including communications from the Kremlin that had not been observed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of signals that Russia only sends when they are preparing something very specific: a major military operation, a significant policy shift, or a genuine diplomatic opening. Observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his approach. And when a wartime leader shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency in the world pays attention. By Wednesday afternoon, the picture became clearer. Through intermediary channels, some say through Turkey, others point to the UI, and still others suggest direct back-channel communication with the incoming Trump administration. Vladimir Putin had transmitted what multiple sources are now describing as a formal ceasefire proposal, not a peace treaty. Not a surrender demand, not the usual list of impossible conditions designed to be rejected. A ceasefire, immediate, 90 days, with the possibility of extension based on progress toward a larger settlement. The details that have emerged are significant. Russia would halt all offensive operations along the current line of contact. Ukraine would do the same. Humanitarian corridors would be established in contested regions. Prisoner exchanges would resume immediately. And most importantly and most controversially, negotiations would begin on the future status of the territories Russia currently occupies. This is not what anyone expected. This is not the Putin we've been watching for 3 years. And when Volodymyr Zelensky received word of this proposal, he understood immediately what it meant. It meant that for the first time since February 2022, there might be a genuine opening. It also meant that if he didn't move fast, that opening could close, or worse, it could be shaped by others without Ukraine at the table. Within hours, Zelensky was on a plane. Destination, Mar-a-Lago. The reaction from Washington was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after classified briefings, described Putin's move as unexpected, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, potentially genuine, which is what made it so dangerous. Because if Putin's ceasefire offer is real, it changes the entire calculus of this conflict. It puts pressure on Ukraine to respond. It puts pressure on NATO to clarify its position. It puts pressure on the incoming Trump administration to decide whether it will embrace, reject, or reshape this proposal. And it puts pressure on Zelensky to make decisions that will determine the fate of his country for generations. Diplomatic pressure only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, his response was among the fastest and most decisive we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know within 6 hours of receiving confirmation of Putin's offer. Zelensky convened his war cabinet in Kyiv. Within 12 hours, he had communicated directly with officials in Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris. Within 18 hours, he was wheels up on a flight to the United States. This wasn't a scheduled visit. This wasn't part of a planned diplomatic tour. This was an emergency mission to Mar-a-Lago, to meet with Donald Trump before the inauguration, before the offer could be interpreted by others, and before Putin could control the narrative of what this ceasefire actually means. Because Zelensky understands something that many observers are only now beginning to grasp. This isn't just about ending the fighting. This is about who gets to define the peace. Tonight, sources close to both the Ukrainian delegation and the Trump transition team confirmed that Zelensky arrived at Mar-a-Lago late Thursday evening. The meeting was not announced in advance. There was no press availability, no photo opportunity, no joint statement. Just a Ukrainian president, a president-elect, and what sources describe as an intense, hours-long discussion about the future of the war. What was discussed? According to multiple officials speaking on condition of anonymity, the conversation focused on 3 key areas. First, the substance of Putin's proposal itself. What exactly is Russia offering? What are the conditions? What are the red lines? And most importantly, what is Russia actually willing to give up versus what they're demanding Ukraine surrender? Second, the role of the United States. Trump has repeatedly promised to end the war quickly. He has criticized the Biden administration's approach. He has suggested he could negotiate directly with Putin. Zelensky needed to understand what is Trump's actual plan, and where does Ukraine fit into it. Third, the question of guarantees. Any ceasefire, any peace deal, any settlement will require security guarantees for Ukraine. Without them, Zelensky knows, any pause in fighting simply gives Russia time to rearm and reattack. What guarantees is the United States willing to provide, and what role will NATO play? Sources say the meeting was frank, at times tense, but ultimately productive. Zelensky reportedly told Trump that Ukraine is willing to negotiate but not willing to surrender. Trump reportedly told Zelensky that he wants a deal but not at any price. And both men, according to those present, agreed on one fundamental point: Putin's offer must be tested. If it's genuine, it could save hundreds of thousands of lives. If it's a trap, it must be exposed. Either way, Ukraine and the United States need to be on the same page. And after Thursday night's meeting, sources say they're closer to that than they've been in months. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the unity of Western support for Ukraine after the U.S. election. Putin wanted to see whether the incoming Trump administration would pressure Zelensky to accept unfavorable terms. But instead, the opposite happened. Zelensky didn't wait to be pressured. He didn't wait for Trump to make the first move. He didn't wait for European allies to coordinate a response. He flew to Mar-a-Lago and shaped the conversation himself. That was so proactive, so strategically sophisticated, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. Their diplomats are experienced. Their intelligence services are formidable. They have spent decades reading Western leaders and exploiting divisions. But today, Zelensky did something they didn't anticipate. He took the initiative. A senior diplomat speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's shift as a probe, a way to test Western cohesion and identify cracks in the alliance. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both capable and unpredictable. His actions were not only swift, they were calibrated so precisely that he arrived at Mar-a-Lago before most European leaders had even finished their internal consultations. That timing matters because it shows Zelensky understands the new political reality. It shows that Ukraine is not a passive recipient of American decisions. They are an active participant in shaping them. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of the diplomatic activity surrounding this moment. European Union officials carried out emergency consultations, forcing a delay in previously scheduled foreign ministers' meetings. NATO headquarters in Brussels targeted its communication strategy to respond to what had been a sudden shift in the diplomatic landscape over the last 48 hours. British intelligence services operating alongside American counterparts reportedly intercepted communications suggesting Moscow was surprised by the speed of Zelensky's response. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't just a diplomatic visit. This was a strategic repositioning. This was a statement of intent. And a statement of intent is the one thing Putin has struggled to counter since Trump's election victory. For every assumption Moscow has made about Western divisions, Zelensky has countered with something that complicates their calculation. They assumed Trump would sideline Ukraine. Zelensky flew to meet him. They assumed Europe would hesitate. European leaders issued statements of support within hours. They assumed this ceasefire offer would create chaos and division. Instead, it created coordination. Remember, Putin thought this war would be over in 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall. He thought Zelensky would flee. He thought the West would issue strongly worded statements and then move on. He thought NATO was weak. He thought Europe was divided. He thought America was distracted. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kyiv stands. Zelensky leads. The West remains engaged. NATO has expanded. Europe has united. America under both Biden and now Trump remains the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine. And Putin, 3 years into a war he expected to win in a weekend, is now offering a ceasefire. That is not a sign of strength. That is a sign that something has changed in Moscow's calculations. What makes this moment so critical and so delicate is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary pressure. Russian hardliners want escalation. They want total victory. They want Ukraine crushed and NATO humiliated. Russian pragmatists want stability. They want sanctions lifted. They want the economy to recover from 3 years of war. Russian oligarchs want their assets back. They want access to Western markets. They want their yachts and their London properties and their Dubai accounts. Russian military commanders want resources. They want replacements for the hundreds of thousands of casualties. They want equipment to replace what's been destroyed. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has cost Russia far more than anyone predicted.